Welcome to the second day of the Parkland Institute's conference on implementing a just transition. Welcome all. We started off the conference with a fantastic panel on people-centered just transitions yesterday, and today we continue the conversation with leading global practices for a just transition. My name is Tamara Kravchenko, and I'm an assistant professor in public administration at the University of Victoria and a former Edmontonian, Treaty 6 territory. And I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples and that of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Hosanich peoples. Justice in the path to decarbonize our economies means not just including stakeholders, but Indigenous rights holders. And the transformation of our economies is a chance for real reconciliation, to change our practices of governance. And we have to make the most of this opportunity. We have to do it right. We can make it place-based, reflecting on our obligations to the land that we live on. I'm Ukrainian Canadian, and I'd like to express my solidarity with Ukraine as they fight a grotesque war against a form of Russian imperialism that has no place in this century. Putin has made clear that Ukrainians are fighting for their very right to exist, and Russian oil is funding this. We have to decarbonize our economies. Against persistent Russian aggression, Ukraine has pulled off incredible feats, one of which is major gains in energy efficiency. And this is inspiration to us. And I hope you all have a chance to visit beautiful Ukraine someday. I study how different countries and regions are working to manage a just transition. And Elder Whiskey Jack told us yesterday that everyone has a gift that they can offer with their knowledge and experience. And I'm very pleased to welcome our distinguished speakers today who have such rich expertise to lend us as we ramp up our own efforts. First, we have Dr. Jim Skee, a professor of sustainable energy at Imperial College in London. He's co-chair of the IPCC Working Group on Climate Mitigation. And in his career, he's brought his scientific expertise to the policy table, including as a member of the UK Committee on Climate Change and as the chair of Scotland's Just Transition Commission. This commission included nationwide public engagement and dialogue, and that's something I'm sure we can learn from. So welcome, Jim. Welcome to Samantha Smith, director of the Just Transition Center, which works to help unions and their allies get good plans for just transitions at all levels. And this includes work here in Canada as well. She was a global climate and energy leader for the World Wildlife Fund and held senior positions at the energy firm Equinor in Norway. And we are so pleased that you could join us, Samantha. Finally, we have Dr. Brian Motherway, who's head of the Energy Efficiency Division at the IEA, the International Energy Agency in Paris. He leads the agency's work with the Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions, and prior to this, he was the chief executive of the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. Welcome, Brian. Small world that it is, our panelists have met one another at some point, it turns out. Each of our speakers will give us an introductory presentation today, and then we're going to have an open discussion. Dr. Skee, I invite you to start us off with a first introduction.
What I'm going to do is just give a very quick tour of what Scotland's Just Transition framework looks like. For those of you who haven't seen Braveheart, just a little bit of Scottish context here. Scotland is obviously a part of the United Kingdom, but it has a separate parliament, which is shown in the top right-hand corner of this slide in Edinburgh, and has a set of defined devolved powers in various policy areas. I would flag, however, that energy policy is reserved for the UK Parliament in Westminster, which gives rise to some interesting tensions. However, environment policy is devolved, and Scotland has a net zero greenhouse gas target by 2045, which includes international aviation and shipping, and a climate change plan which is updated every year, and a just transition is actually embedded in the Scottish Climate Change Act. And just to say, there's high-level political interest in just transition climate change in Scotland. At the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, you can see Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, along with the support team from IPCC Working Group 3 when we had a meeting of authors in Edinburgh. I have to say everyone was incredibly impressed by the speech that we got from Scotland's First Minister, which really demonstrated the kind of the political will behind the low carbon agenda. So, Just Transition Scotland, the Scottish Trades Union Congress and Friends of the Earth Scotland got together maybe 5 or 6 years ago to form a Just Transition partnership that pressed the Scottish Government to put in place a Just Transition Commission that would help to reconcile and bring together basically the trade union movement and the environmental movement agendas, recognising that they need not be working against each other. So the Just Transition Commission, I think, was established about the end of 2018. It was set up to provide practical, realistic and affordable recommendations to Scottish ministers, covering many of the obvious issues around labour markets and just transitions, but also saying in this part 3 of the remit on this slide, to think about regional cohesion, inequalities, poverty, and a sustainable and inclusive labour market. So it was an interesting sort of slight stretch of the just transition concept. The membership of the Commission, it's not an academic body, it's basically a group of people who had interests. So there were 2 representatives from trade unions, there were a couple of NGOs, a number of people from the industrial side, including SSE, which is one of Scotland's biggest utilities, and the Oil and Gas Technology Centre, which has now renamed itself the Net Zero Energy Technology Centre. And I'll be coming on to this, but land use and agriculture are also a big issue in Scotland. So we had a representative from Quality Meat Scotland, which is actually the body that provides certificates for sustainably reduced beef. And just to say, this person was also an active farmer and a qualified veterinary surgeon at the same time, with a couple of academics involved. The way we worked, we could have sat in windowless offices in Edinburgh and Glasgow the whole time, which is what you can see at the bottom right-hand corner of this slide. But what we did for each of our meetings before we unfortunately had to enter Zoom world was that we were going out and visiting particular parts of Scotland, relating this to the theme of the meeting we were looking at. So top left-hand corner, we met at the Coalfields Regeneration Trust for our very first meeting, which is situated where many of Scotland's old coal mines were located, also right next to Scotland's last coal-fired power station, which closed in 2016. Bottom left-hand corner, talking with farmers in the Borders region with England, and at the bottom in the middle, we were meeting with oil and gas professionals in Aberdeen, which is the centre of Scotland's offshore industry. The top right-hand corner, we were actually visiting a refinery and petrochemical complex, but this more illustrates the question of economic diversification in the area towards tourism. It was much more photogenic than the pipework, if we can be honest about that. We ran for just over 2 years, and we produced a final report just under 2 years ago, but we had 2 intermediate reports to give our initial thinking, and then we were asked by the Scottish Government for specific advice on how just transition could be linked to a green recovery from the COVID situation. So just in terms of the initial meeting, we spent a lot of time thinking about the scope. And one that I want to emphasise is that it's not just about energy, it's not just about oil and gas, it's not even about the supply side of the economy. We had a very strong push to think of people as consumers and the importance of communities and the importance of place. So that's something we got in already. And another message that we wanted to get, this is not just about avoiding injustices in the future. The world at the moment is a very unjust place, and we were looking at the kind of opportunities for addressing existing injustices. So I've picked up that some, that are important in Scotland, the question of land tenure, actually land and agriculture is a very, very difficult issue for Scotland because of the concentration of land ownership. The question of fair work, which is obviously central to just transition as traditionally seen, and the question of energy poverty. I mean, anybody who's stayed in a Scottish house in the middle of winter will appreciate the poor degree of thermal insulation. It costs people on low incomes a lot of money sometimes to heat their homes, and this is something we need to address as part of the agenda. On the Green Recovery Report, which came out around the summer of 2020, just to give you a flavour for some of the issues we picked up there, our first recommendation was around investment in warmer homes, and particularly this question of energy efficiency and low carbon heat programmes we picked up. We were particularly concerned on the back of the COVID crisis about lack of public trust in public transport, and we're worried about the issues there, that increased private car use could be setting us in the wrong direction. Plus, we have an important supply chain in Scotland. We do manufacture hydrogen fuel cell and electric buses, and there was an opportunity there to put a plug in a socket. And finally, one I think that's very relevant for Alberta, the question of maintaining and creating new jobs for oil and gas workers. And this was particularly important in the context of green recovery because COVID, one of the indirect effects was to bring down the price of oil, which leads to layoffs in the oil and gas industry, which can be extremely volatile in terms of employment. And I think that's one of the interesting questions. If people can move to new sources of employment in renewable energy, can more stable sources of employment actually be created? We were also very interested in the idea of accelerating decommissioning of Scotland's offshore oil and gas industry and repurposing it for offshore renewables, for example, were some of the issues that were being picked up there. So just straight on to our final report, and we had 24 recommendations in all, which is too much to deliver all at once. So grouped into 4 different themes, we suggested that we needed an orderly managed transition to make it clear to all partners and stakeholders what direction we were all intending to go. And it was very much the idea that an unplanned transition is an unjust transition. And the example of the rundown of the coal industry in Scotland and other parts of the UK was just the frequent example that was given there. The second vital theme on the supply side, the labour market, equipping people with the skills and education that they need to take advantage of the transition. And that both applies to training mid-career as people might change direction, but also early years education, so that right at university, school level, people are being trained for the kind of skills in the world that we will be moving into. I may say under this, we also identified many obstacles to actually transitioning within the energy sector. For example, one of the things I never knew about, if you were a diver on a North Sea oil and gas platform, it would cost you about £2,000 sterling to undertake the training that would allow you to do much the same job on an offshore wind platform. That's the kind of thing we need to take down some of the obstacles for. The importance of local communities and strengthening local economies there. I have to say many of the individual recommendations there were quite specific to the Scottish circumstances. And the final one was very much about the economics, the who pays and where any burdens might fall. We are very concerned, for example, in the move to electric vehicles, how that affects rural communities as opposed to urban communities. And equally the question, if we're upgrading the Scottish housing stock and moving perhaps to electric heating, which is low carbon rather than fossil fuels, how can people afford the capital costs of that? Where will these cost burdens fall? So these were the 4 themes that we came out with in our final report. Now, the moment that we produced the report, the Scottish Government said that it would accept all our 24 recommendations in full, which made us all regret that we hadn't been more ambitious there. But so 24 was just a bit too successful. But the outcome from that has been that Scotland now has a Minister for Just Transition, Employment and Fair Work to coordinate things right across the Scottish Government system. We have a just transition planning framework that's been put in place, which will be an umbrella for a set of sectoral just transition plans. And that will start with an energy strategy and just transition plan, which I now have to remember is an ESJTP. That is the first one on the agenda. and other particular issues around the skills agenda, an emergency skills action plan, and a green jobs fund, and many other initiatives actually moving forward there. The Just Transition Commission Mark I actually folded up almost a year ago, but a new commission has been established. And I think, as Tamara said, I'm chairing that new commission, which has just been appointed. We've had one meeting. We have our second meeting in a week's time. And the first task of that commission is to provide scrutiny on the Scottish Government's plans, to be a kind of critical friend on what government is up to, whether it's delivering on its objectives, so scrutiny and advice. We will be thinking about how we monitor and evaluate the progress that government is making. And our meeting next week will actually be thinking about indicators and how we put flesh on the bones of that monitoring and evaluation. And we will continue the habit we built in the first Scottish Just Transition Commission of engaging with local communities and getting round the country. On number 4, engaging and collaborating with other sources of expertise. Scotland, for a small country, has a large number of advisory bodies. So the Fuel Poverty Advisory Group, the Human Rights Commission, other people are other parallel bodies with which we will be engaging. And we will be reporting annually to the government and publishing it every year, just ahead of Scotland producing its new programme for government, which takes place annually. I said to a colleague I would just finish off with one other thing. In parallel to the Just Transition Commission, there was actually a Scottish Climate Assembly working in parallel, which was much more about engaging ordinary people in a very, very thorough way with climate change. And the question that Climate Assembly was addressing was how you tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way. That was the one homework question. And the idea of it, I think there was around 70 people, just ordinary people selected, intended to be democratically representative, who spent quite a bit of time over a period of several weekends, first of all, getting more chances to learn about climate change and what could be done about it. They were entitled to call in experts and give them a good grilling. I was called in, and I can promise you I did get a good grilling from them, which was very educational. And then they deliberated and came up with some recommendations for the Scottish Government, coming from a very bottom-up perspective. And just to say, it was a kind of learning journey. They initially signed up, I think, for 5 or 6 weekends. And in fact, they liked it so much, they asked to get another weekend and had a 7th weekend put on the end of it. But they divided their activities up around diet, land use and lifestyle, homes and communities, and travel and work. And that's the way they divided up their learning journey and the way they called in the experts. And it also helped to form the basis for their recommendations. And at the end of it, the Climate Assembly, it picked out 16 broad goals and came up with 81 recommendations in all, grouped under the themes that you can see on the right-hand side. And I must say, I ran very quickly through these again, and it was very striking. There wasn't a single mention of oil and gas in any of these, in spite of the importance certainly to parts of Scotland. A lot of it was much more about the engagement of ordinary people in their everyday lives. And so I think this is quite striking that broadening the concept of just transition has, I think, helped to engage quite a lot of people. I should say Elliot Ross ran this process, and he is now he's running the Secretariat for the new Just Transition Commission. So we will be kind of bringing the Assembly and the Just Transition process together.
Dr. Ski, thank you so much. We are focused on really understanding implementation, action, how we organize ourselves. And I think Scotland's framework and how it mobilized civil society actors is just really useful for us. I think that some of the types of conversations that you mentioned that have spurred, for instance, even the creation of the commission with the Just Transitions Partnership civil society group as well, really show how you can coalesce action and start moving things and create a framework that deals with sectoral priorities and other priorities. So thank you for that. I would like to invite Samantha Smith to provide her introduction.
Thank you very much, Tamara. So I work for the International Trade Union Confederation, which is the global federation for most of the world's unions. We represent 200 million organized workers in 162 countries. In Canada, our affiliate is the Canadian Labour Congress. ITUC set up the Just Transition Center in 2016 to deliver on a couple of things. And I'm going to mention them because it's sort of important that we have a common understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about just transition. The labor movement spent about 2 decades trying to negotiate global UN rules for just transition in 2 places. One is the International Labor Organization, the ILO, where in 2015, the ILO produced guidelines for just transition, which I would encourage you to read because they're the basis for most of the work that the labor movement does on just transition around the world, what a lot of governments do for rules on just transition in the European Union, in South Africa, a bunch of other countries. But also that's what you find in the Paris Agreement on climate change, also negotiated in 2015, which also, thanks to a lot of work by unions and our allies, refers to the just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs. So just to say a few more things about this UN definition of just transition, which is the one that we're using in the labor movement. It has a couple of key features. So one is that you always have to have this process called social dialogue, which is a process of negotiation between workers in our organization, so unions, employers and their associations, and government. And this is the place where you negotiate all the aspects of just transition that relate to people's jobs, to skills and training, but you will also probably discuss things like expanded unemployment insurance, public services, and maybe investments that create jobs in regions. And then at the same time, the government should be convening everybody, so stakeholders as they're called, for this robust process of getting everybody's views about what should happen in a just transition, which also has these goals of eliminating poverty and achieving gender equality. And so what you've just heard from Jim is really this broad process of stakeholder engagement, but there are also processes which are just between the employers and the unions, for example, of collective bargaining about jobs in this new economy. If it doesn't have unions at the table negotiating with employers and governments, then it probably isn't a just transition. It's something else that might be really great. One other thing I want to say just in the Canadian context is that First Nations would probably be part of a social dialogue process as nations, right? And just to give you an example, in New Zealand, we've worked quite a lot with our affiliates in New Zealand, and there the Maori people are treated as a government in negotiating social dialogue around just transition. So they appear together with the settler government, the unions, and the employers. I think a few other things about what we do and maybe some thoughts about how this is relevant, could be relevant, up to you, for what's happening in Alberta. So we were set up, as I said, to deliver on these big international processes, but actually much closer to the ground. And so we work with federations and unions in high emitting sectors, so oil and gas, power and mining, steel, cement, construction, transport, auto, a little bit in agriculture in high emitting countries around the world. So Canada and the US, yes, but also Brazil, Colombia, South Africa, Indonesia, India, across the European Union, but also in Central and Eastern European states, UK and Scotland, where we're very happy to see our affiliates represented in these different commissions and groups, and New Zealand and Australia. I just want to sum up some of the things that we've learned maybe on these points about organizing. How do you build broad consensus around the change? The first point from our experience is that we don't just represent our members. In a lot of countries, unions are also bargaining for or trying to bring into decent work people who today aren't union members, but should be, but who nonetheless, regardless of whether or not they're members, we should all have good wages, we should be safe at work, and we should have good benefits and conditions. So we need to be at the table. And so when you see processes where there's no unions there and employers are going, yeah, we don't really do that organized labor thing, then that's immediately a red flag about whether it's just transition. But more to the point, as those of you from the labor movement will know, if we're not out in the discussion from the start, then we're probably not going to be very happy about the outcome. So if we're thinking again about this broad consensus building, then it's really important that we are at the table. I think some other experiences that we have in North America, so especially in the US, but a bit in Canada, people in the energy sector especially are suspicious about the term just transition because, quite rightly, they've seen lots of transitions and they usually end up with people losing their job. And we work a lot with energy sector unions of different kinds, including the building trades. When we're working with unions on a process around just transition, we don't necessarily start out talking about climate change. We talk about sort of core trade union business, which is jobs. Second learning to put out there is that there are relatively few people in this world who are going to willingly become unemployed for any reason, but maybe also for a reason that might seem kind of remote, which would be climate change. As a climate activist myself, I can say, being unemployed is a pretty terrible thing in many countries, including, and it can also be pretty terrible in Canada. So if your conversation starts out with people losing their jobs and stuff shutting down, you're lost, right? People aren't going to listen to you. A lot of people are going to turn off. A good process around just transition, whether it's social dialogue or these broader processes like Jim was talking about, starts out from our perspective with what are the new jobs? Because that's always the question we get. How do we get them? What's the path from here to there? Then the second set of questions are about another important part, which is what's the safety net? What's the social protection system? So what about me? I'm an older worker. My pension's going to vest in 3 or 4 years. I can't really retrain and get a new job. So do I get a bridge to pension? Will my pension be secure? Will the company go bankrupt and, there goes my pension, and so on. So all those questions around expanded UI, securing pensions, people not having to retrain on their own expense and on their own time, but actually the employer or the government paying for retraining or supporting unions to offer retraining courses so that we can help people get into new jobs through our networks. All of those things are really critically important. I think another thing that, is going to feel very current is about who pays. Right? The problem isn't that there isn't enough money in any system. The problem is that the money is in the wrong hands. And so workers should not be paying for our own just transition. Working class families should not be paying in the form of high energy prices or high costs of transport, but actually just transition rests on this foundation of fair tax. So that means both that companies, but also wealthy individuals need to pay their tax in order for us to have this transition. Because I think one other learning is that in every country that is embarked on a big just transition plan, so we're talking about big economies, we're talking about Germany, Spain, South Africa now, we're also working a lot with the unions in California, which is the world's seventh biggest economy if it actually were a country. All of these processes are driven by the national government, because the scale of the investments that you need in everything from infrastructure to technology development and so on is very hard to do at a local level. And you also can't do it just on collective bargaining. So while bottom-up efforts are important and great, you also need the state. So that would be another big lesson that we have. In order to get this big transition, you're going to need state action at different levels. The other things that I want to talk about specifically about oil and gas, we're just starting an initiative with our affiliates and their energy sector affiliates from major oil producing countries. And that's going to be a series of discussions about technology pathways to just transition. So basically, will the new jobs, will they be in hydrogen? Will they be in renewable energy? Will they be in batteries and storage? Will they be in services? Will they be in carbon capture and storage or carbon capture and use, and so on? One of the questions that we all have as workers, and also for me as a former worker in the oil and gas sector, is how many jobs are there really? when do the jobs come? How much skills transfer is there from the jobs that people have today to these jobs that they might be getting in the new energy sector? What are the policies, investments, collective bargaining agreements that we need in order to make sure that all of these jobs materialize, and they materialize pretty quickly? Because one of the worst things that can happen is that people engage in this process and then the jobs don't come quickly enough, or the investments. There are changes going on in the sector, and I'm not just talking about the sort of falling off a cliff of demand during COVID and the rebound now, and who knows what's going to happen now with energy prices because of the attack on the Ukraine. But there are also changes because of climate change. And in our view, we're not doing workers any favors if we say to our members, no change is coming. We're going to continue with $100 a barrel oil for the next while. You don't need to worry, right? We do need to worry. And as unions, we need to be ready. We have a right to know. We have a right to know from the government. We also have a right to know from the employers. What are their plans, and what are the jobs, and what is the pathway for us? I'd like to conclude with an example from the country of Spain. Actually, I was looking at this just yesterday and talking to the former head of employee representation at Repsol in Spain. Repsol is a Spanish oil company, but most of its business is in refineries, a little bit less relevant for Alberta. But at any rate, they've committed to this net zero by 2050 commitment that you see a lot of companies, including, I believe, Suncor, jumping onto. And initially, they weren't very clear about what their plans were. The unions that organized them were demanding plans. And what they've done now is very interesting. So they've now come out with a plan to basically repurpose most of their refineries, primarily to use green hydrogen in the refinery operations themselves. So bringing down emissions in the traditional refining of petroleum, but then also eventually converting refineries to sort of new industrial sites based on hydrogen, based on petrochemicals, and based on actually recycling of petrochemical and plastic products. So there are examples of employers that are changing their operations pretty dramatically. And I think that those would be good examples to look at for those of you who are organized in the labor movement in Alberta, and you want to start making demands to your employers, as well as coming with proposals to government employers about what should happen next. I'll just close with a word of solidarity to our sisters and brothers in the Ukraine. I know many of you have family and friends there. Our hearts go out to you, and also to the Ukrainian trade unions. At our best, the labor movement is a peace movement, because we know that in any conflict, it is the working class that gets sent to fight, and also the working class that will suffer the most on the front lines. So we want to express our solidarity with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha, for your solidarity, and you're inspiring us, as you can see in the comments section. Those are just great examples, and they're really hopeful, in fact. And you're reiterating to us how vital it is that the union movement has such a strong seat at the table as we manage these processes. And thank you for also mentioning New Zealand and how well, the iwi and the Maori have been included in the just transitions process. One lesson for us is that the trade union in New Zealand put out just transition principles. And the very first principle was solidarity with Maori and the fact that their voices need to be included. And that's beautiful how that was framed. And we can do the same here in Canada. So thank you for that inspiration. Brian, I'm so pleased to welcome you next.
Thank you, Tamara. It's a great pleasure with my fellow panelists. And on this difficult time, I do want to join my fellow panelists to express solidarity to the people of Ukraine in these difficult days. And I just reflect that maybe the topic we're discussing today is all the more important as we talk about resilience in our energy systems, and we talk about the future of workers and people in the context of clean energy transition. Let me just set a little bit of context before I talk about our work in this area in terms of why we're talking about energy transitions in the first place. And I do want to start by reminding everyone that we are very, very far from a path towards a net zero energy system. Whether you call it net zero, clean energy, decarbonisation, whichever phrase you use. We saw some progress in the last year. We saw many countries making more ambitious pledges towards net zero at 2050 thereabouts. We saw some additional initiatives at COP26 in Glasgow, including the methane pledge, which is very, very important. But even if all of those are fully implemented, which is a very big if, it still doesn't, it gets us maybe a little bit below 2 degrees. It doesn't get us fully onto the Paris Agreement, and it certainly doesn't get us in the direction of net zero by 2050. Even more than that, in 2021, we saw one of the biggest single year-on-year increases in global greenhouse gas emissions that we've ever recorded. So we're not even starting on that journey in many ways towards the journey we need to take towards net zero. And so action needs to be taken urgently and very deeply. And in that context, we in the IEA have looked at what a pathway towards net zero by 2050 might look like. And I don't want to dwell on it here today, it's not our topic. The point I want to make is it involves hundreds of milestones, hundreds of actions in every sector. It changes our lives in the way we travel, the way we use energy, the infrastructure around us. All of our lives are going to change. There's going to be changes in employment, and changes in buildings, changes in cities and landscapes. And all of this is really why people need to be at the center of this process. Clean energy transitions are for people and about people. We want to transform the energy system so that we can protect people from the worst ravages of climate change, so that we can create new quality jobs, so that we can improve air quality in cities, so we can provide energy access and affordable energy to more people than have it today. So at the heart, it really is a people-centered project, which sometimes I think we forget in some of the conversations I'm in, where we're talking about technologies and policies and things, we forget to mention the word people so often. Secondly, even if you didn't believe all of that, we have no chance of success in clean energy transitions if we don't bring people with us, if people don't accept the changes that are coming, if they don't participate actively, if they don't change their behavior, if they're not willing to see transformations go on around them, then these will fail very quickly. And we see many examples where social acceptance allows projects to fall at the first hurdle when people try relatively modest, relatively simple changes in energy systems. If the communications aren't right, if the engagement isn't right, if the buy-in isn't there, they will fail, and we know that for sure. In that context, last year, our executive director set up something called the Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transition. This is a global conversation among energy and climate ministers, representatives from labour, youth, civil society, energy access questions, with people from all geographies and all perspectives. We were very pleased to have the Prime Minister of Denmark as our patron. The process was chaired by the Energy Minister of Denmark and co-chaired by the Energy Minister of Senegal. We have many really excellent, wise people that we brought together and worked with over the course of last year to really ask them what works. So back to your theme tomorrow of implementation. In your experience, what works on the ground to make energy policies, climate action more people-centered, more inclusive, and more likely to succeed? And so we spent the year working with the Global Commission, and late last year, just before COP, in fact, the Commission made a set of action-oriented recommendations to help other decision makers, whether it's ministers, CEOs, policymakers, civil society more broadly, understand what we have learned from global best practice and indeed global bad practice to help us understand how to make clean energy transitions more inclusive and more people-centered. The 12 recommendations come under 4 themes. They are decent jobs and worker protection, which I'll come back to in a minute. Also social and economic development. How do we align clean energy transition with making people's lives better, enhancing their wealth, bringing energy access to more people, improving quality of life, and of course, very current today, enhance energy security and resilience in that context. The third theme was that of equity, social inclusion, and fairness, which Jim touched on. This is everything from making sure that clean energy policies really are designed on the foundations of equality and equity, gender equity, social inclusion, addressing in a positive way the needs of marginalized communities, but also avoiding disproportionate effects on poor people, avoiding designing regressive policies such as those that only favor people who can afford to participate. All of these questions, and of course, they're very important to mention there, is to include the voice of younger generations in decision makers, and that was a major theme of our work last year. We were talking to youth representatives around the world, including those that were members of the Commission. Finally, again, as we're touching on today, the fourth theme was the question of people as active participants. It's the kind of processes that Jim has been talking about, both the Just Transition Commission, but also the Citizens Assembly, which many countries have been doing similar processes recently, including my own home country of Ireland, where I was privileged to go and participate in a couple of years ago. These are proving very successful, as Jim's example showed, and other themes here, including behavior change, and of course, conversations like today where we can learn from each other. I'm struck in that regard how similar some of these recommendations are to some of the recommendations that Jim showed. It reminds me that many of these themes are universal, they really are global, but at the same time, every context is really very different. There are many different circumstances on the ground, not just at a national level, but at a sub-national level, whether we're talking about political economy context, whether we're talking about energy resources, we're talking about the well-being or the economic development of citizens. There are some themes that South Africa, Canada, and India and Germany have in common, but there are many local differences as well. So policies really need a lot of tailoring for that. Let me just spend a couple of minutes tomorrow talking about some of the themes that I think are most pertinent to today's conversation around the first theme here of decent jobs and work protection. The first recommendation that the Commission made was that transition should be designed to maximize the creation of decent jobs. Decent is an important word there, but it's also important to say that transitions aren't just technocratic projects about eliminating carbon from our energy systems. They're not all about cost benefits in terms of tons of CO2 versus euros or dollars spent. They also need to be designed with people at the heart, and particularly with the creation of decent jobs at the heart. And there are many examples that the Commission highlighted. I should say that the Commission, when it published its recommendations, we also published a data bank of over 150 global best practice examples that are cited by the Commission. And all of this is available freely on our website if you want to find out more details about any of these. I won't dwell on these examples in any length today, but I'm happy to discuss them further. Just to say that countries from Denmark to Canada, many in between, we see them looking for new clean energy opportunities that will directly redeploy the skills and the people and the infrastructure related to sunset sectors such as oil and gas and coal, and looking for opportunities to match the skill set, create good quality job opportunities for those that might lose their jobs in sectors that will decline in the future. We see countries like India and here in the EU aligning their clean energy strategies with their industrial development strategies and actually linking, for example, in India, talking about developing indigenous sectors around technologies such as solar panels, lithium batteries, and things like that. EU putting a strong focus on renewables also, but also energy efficiency and creating jobs in energy efficiency. So a lot of good practice in aligning goals here, which I think is really very important. The second recommendation of the Commission was to develop tailored government support for communities and workers with an additional focus on skills and training. And again, many really good examples in recent years of just transition programs, agreements. Jim's work in Scotland is really exemplary and was highlighted by the Global Commission. We see very good processes in countries ranging from Germany, Denmark, Spain, as Sam mentioned. South Africa doing very interesting work. In my view, Canada doing some very interesting work. You can tell me whether you agree or not here in the EU. And just when we're talking about skills, let me mention in passing that the Canadian government at a federal level is one of the leaders of a new initiative under the Clean Energy Ministerial called Empowering People Initiative. We're very pleased to be working with them, looking at questions about reskilling, preparing workforces of the future. And I very much commend Canada's leadership at a global level in this initiative and in many areas related to just transition. Just let me mention one more recommendation to highlight, which is the role of social dialogue, stakeholder engagement, policy coordination. Sam has spoken very well about this. We see the central importance of social dialogue. Let me first say that those just transition processes that have shown any success, and I have to say that some have been more successful than others, and there's plenty of bad practice to see as well. But those that have shown the most success have been long-term processes that have been resource-intensive, people-intensive, finance-intensive. And there are real questions here about whether the kind of money that, say, Germany has spent, in redeploying people and communities in its former coal regions, can that kind of level of investment be afforded by the countries the likes of Senegal, South Africa, Guyana, Indonesia, many other countries that are facing similar issues? And I think there's a north-south finance question there in terms of affordability and where the money comes from and who pays for very important work here. Some of the social dialogue processes that I think have been really interesting. South Africa has probably one of the most fascinating and impressive ones. because it really needs to. Coal is so central to South Africa. Poverty levels and employment levels are really, really high. So getting this right really, really matters. And this is very much led from the top. And the Presidential Commission, convened by President Ramaphosa, is really doing some very interesting work, and I think it's well worth looking at. Germany has had an interesting process over many years around getting out of coal that, as I say, has been quite successful, but has involved very high spends financially, which is something to be commended, of course. Spain, I've mentioned. And I do believe, as an outside observer, that the task force on just transition to Canadian coal power workers community that I have been observing, just reading, talking to some of the people involved, has promoted some really interesting dialogue in many parts of Canada, including in Alberta. I'd be interested to hear if other people have views on that, but I think there's some very interesting learnings about how really to go into communities, talk to people directly and honestly, talk about the good things and the bad things, get their views, and really work together towards better solutions. I just wanted to highlight those out of the 12 recommendations. There are many others we could certainly talk about. I think this is an action plan, that governments can use to learn from each other and from the experience of others in terms of what works and what doesn't work. This is work we will very much be continuing. We're working with all of our governments and many stakeholders, including colleagues here today, to further this agenda. And our job ultimately is to help governments make better policies so that we can see that clean energy transitions are more people-centered, more inclusive, and that delivers better outcomes for all. So let me stop there, Tamara. I'm very happy to join in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. This is such a useful global picture. Tons of inspiration for us. I would like to start off with a broad question to all of you. You have pointed out to us some key mechanisms, some principles, some inspiring examples. This is where you work, you live and breathe this every day. What are you most inspired by that you're seeing incredible progress in the day-to-day work that you do?
Well, when I started in 2016, it was actually the work of the Alberta Federation of Labor that was inspiring me, and the process that they had with their members around the just transition out of coal, the way that they negotiated all these supports for people, different ways that they worked also rural coal workers who were part-time farmers, the way that the previous Alberta government was able to support this both through negotiations but also through investment in the form of the carbon tax. Not to touch on a bunch of sore points at once, but this was actually exemplary work. And I have to say that in the work that we do, I always remember something that Gil McGowan said to me early on, which was, if we don't organize our own people, someone else is going to come along and organize them for us, and we're really not going to like that. So that's one source of inspiration. And I think the other source of inspiration is just that now we've got 5 years of working with unions around the world in some of the toughest frontline sectors for just transition. So you're talking coal miners, people working in coal-fired power stations, oil and gas workers, and so on. And we see that this works. So when you do it right, you actually do, however painfully, get to good new jobs for people, bridge to pension, but also this sort of general agreement that, we're going to move forward in this way. So I find that super inspiring, and I am also kind of a technology geek. So I'm also pretty inspired by the role that some of the new technologies are going to play in just transition, but also the ease and excitement with which our members grasp them.
That is so great. And that's a nice reminder to us in Alberta, right? That we can do it again. We can build up, we can scale. Jim?
I could think of lots of good news, bad news examples, actually. Let me try to focus just on one thing. I think what I counted as a big success in Scotland was the fact that our Just Transition Commission actually worked on the first phase, and it held together with such a variety of people from different backgrounds who ended up having each other's backs and having solidarity with each other. I think it was particularly important, if you look at the history, that two movements came together to recognise the trade union movement and the environmental movement, each recognising the other. And it's worthwhile saying that the Scottish environmental NGOs have always had a very strong social conscience. The social dimensions of sustainable development have always been incredibly important. But I think that, the fact that the way we work together, this thing about going around the country was not just about listening to other people. We also listened to each other. I mean, it's very helpful to have a bunch of townies, which most of us were, actually going trampling through the cattle sheds, then going together to talk about it and learn about how difficult it is to work in other people's sectors. You always think yours is difficult and somebody else's is easy. It's not. As an energy person, I'm just humbled by the difficulties of the land sector, for example, and some of the challenges there. And by the end of it, we had a point, where there was a particularly difficult circumstance where a particular yard that could have been producing components for wind turbines closed. And everybody on that commission had each other's back for it. And I think that was a really good message. It's the importance of keeping the dialogue going, because only then do you understand each other.
That's great. Brian?
Yeah, I mean, we're dealing with difficult issues, Tamara, and issues that affect people's lives. It can be quite, emotionally challenging for people who are being told they might lose their jobs or their communities might change. In that context, I see a lot of really committed people, a lot of good people and good practices. And I have to say that both Jim and Sam's work I find very inspiring. Just how committed and people focused it really is. And they're two examples among many that I have met since we started working on this topic that have inspired me. And just to mention one personal one, as it happens, because Jim talked about citizens' assemblies and the processes. Several decades ago, I won't say how many, I did my own doctoral dissertation on how to involve people in decision-making around environmental questions. And one thing I looked at quite a lot was the idea of citizens' assemblies, because at that point, nobody had really done it at a national, meaningful level in the way that it influenced policy. Now there are maybe a dozen really good examples to cite where the process really was done very well, but policy then flowed from it. That policymakers really listened to what the citizens came up with. And I have to say, having studied them and then had the chance to be the equivalent of Jim, an expert witness in the Irish one a couple of years ago, it's an inspiring place to spend a day. If you ever get to join one or watch one online, they're typically 99 citizens randomly selected by demographics from around the country, no particular background in the issue. They were willing to volunteer weekends after weekends of their time. And they ask intelligent, probing questions. They work together in a positive way. They come up with really intelligent, interesting solutions. They're willing to compromise. They're always ambitious. They're always progressive in trying to figure out solutions. And it gives one great faith that when these processes are done well, people really do respond and great outcomes will follow.
Thank you. Those are all super great and encouraging. And we need good news, right? To keep motivated. I'm going to go by order of popularity for the questions. And the first question I'd like to pose, Nicholas Vaines has posed this question. Thank you, Nicholas. And he asks Dr. Ski, he says, your presentation was interesting, especially regarding the transition out of fossil fuels, repurposing oil and gas infrastructure. In Canada, this industry is known to delay and obstruct the transition. How has the oil and gas industry acted in Scotland regarding the just transitions policies that were presented?
This is quite a complicated question to answer, because the offshore oil and gas regime in the North Sea is a mature regime and it's already coming down. One of the things that you see when you have a declining regime like that is that the major companies tend to get out of it, and they tend to leave it to mid-size and smaller companies who come to get the last bit of molecules out from under the ground or under the sea. And there is a background of a move away from payroll employment towards contractualization, which has implications in terms of job security, people's responsibility for their own training and just the vulnerability. So that's a background that wasn't prompted by it. So what I think you're seeing with I gave the example of the Oil and Gas Technology Centre that's now the Net Zero Technology Centre. This is an example of how the more sophisticated end of the oil and gas industry can repurpose itself, in a sense, and try to think about how you rebrand, how you think about the opportunities in hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. Many of the smaller companies frankly don't have many other places to go to. And I think this is a big challenge. And we've had a lot of issues raised by trade union members, for example, about declining basic health and safety standards as well as anything else. So I think this is a particularly difficult challenge. And the big issue in Scotland and for the UK is, frankly, what do you do about new oil and gas? Because there are potentially exploitable oil and gas fields out there, but the net zero scenario that Brian showed, you can meet all the oil needs that you have with existing fields. And so there's a big public debate going on about whether we should exploit these new oil and gas fields at all. And that is a point where there's actually been quite a big public debate going, with a consortium of many of the smaller and mid-sized companies making very strong statements like, please don't even talk about oil and gas because you'll scare off the investors. That was the way the conversation went. So it's a challenge.
We have a question here, Emily Eaton, that kind of flows into that from what Dr. Ski just spoke about, perhaps for Samantha Smith, which is what kind of just transition provisions are unions specifically negotiating in their contracts?
It depends on the level, right? So if you're talking about like a global framework agreement, which some big energy companies have with the Global Union Federation Industrial, or with the public services union, sometimes in the energy sector, then those agreements sometimes will have a just transition provision, which is about the company committing to sort of basic ILO conventions on decent work and so on, but also committing to a process in the Works Council, so in the global group of unions that meet with the company management to talk about any big structural changes or decisions. I know some of this, if for North Americans, is like, what? Unions meeting with company management to decide the direction? But actually, for a lot of the European companies, we're on the board and we have high union density. So we actually do have something we can say about which way things are going to go. So we have these, global agreements on just transition. We are actually now starting an initiative where we're going to work with a few big multinational energy companies to try to get like single purpose just transition agreements, which will be about, amongst other things, transparency. So what are your plans, having to report on plans against indicators, meetings with unions, and so on. More closer to the ground, so a just transition provisions could be as simple as just having extended notice period and extended severance pay, right? So that if for any reason you're working in coal in the Philippines and you're organized, if you lose your job, you will have 6 months instead of 3 months of severance pay. So that's just the basic thing. Other things could be about agreements on skills and training. So, for example, that the employer is going to pay for you to have what we would call portable skills. So those are skills that are recognized. Jim gave the example of divers working on oil and gas platforms. They can't work on wind turbines. But, more sort of generic way, let's say that the employer is going to pay for you to have an IBW course as a journeyman electrician, get certified that way. And those are skills you'll have with you for the rest of your life. Other things that are critically important in terms of agreements would be what we call retain, retrain, and redeploy. When a company is going to shift its asset base. So let's say you're an oil and gas company, you're like, hey, we're going to develop renewables and, have a bunch of charging stations. Doesn't that sound good? Yeah, it's good as long as you're not going to fire everybody who's working for you today and hire a bunch of new people. So we want them to keep the people they have, retrain us, and redeploy us in different parts of the company. And we have been successful at getting those kinds of agreements with energy companies in transition.
I was just going to follow up on what Samantha said, because one, I think, very important factor in some of the new industries that are coming through is that the state or the public sector does play a big role. And I'm giving the example of the kind of feed-in tariffs or the contracts for differences that have been used to promote renewable energy. And in the UK, they've been very successful at driving down the costs of offshore wind in particular, but sometimes at the cost of really cutting corners in terms of employment contracts, the nature of the people who are working there. So there can be a big role for the public sector in introducing conditionality into some of these conditions that forces the people who are successful in these contracts to build just transition principles in. So I think the role of the public sector, say, is still very important.
Critically important what Jim just said, because, in most countries, like the government, maybe unfortunately including the military, is one of the biggest procurers of everything, especially construction, but also manufactured goods. And if governments put job standards, so labor standards, prevailing wage, pension, training, and so forth, they attach it to their procurement system and to public money, like investment and infrastructure. That goes a long way towards creating good jobs.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question that perhaps would be directed maybe to Brian or Jim. It's asked by Franco Savoya. He says there's this common theme where implementing a just transition requires multi-sector and shareholder engagement or stakeholder engagement or rights holder engagement. But not all sectors like civil society or lived experience have capacity to participate. So how do we support engagement to get people who are interested but might not have capacity? How do we make sure we don't miss voices? Are there some practices for us to consider?
I think it's a very good question. The classic problem with kind of participatory democracy methodologies, and not everybody wants to spend all their time in public meetings talking about these things. But most of us live in contexts of representative democracies, and our role is to vote for people who support things that we want to see happen, and to make our own participation in terms of our behavior, our purchase decisions, all that kind of thing. And of course, in specific contexts, particularly the one we're talking about here today, in terms of like social dialogue as workers or as members of particular, sectors. I don't think we're painting a picture that everybody has to spend all their time in town halls talking about the future of their community. But I think the practitioners of these kind of methods, including those Jim has talked about, have learned a lot over the last couple of decades about how to do this well and how to do this intelligently, and it can be done. Having said that, the next phase of net zero is like nothing we've done before in this space in terms of the extent of change that's coming. And, I live here in France, and a couple of years ago, the government tried to put 5 cents on a litre of gasoline. I'm not sure what to call it in other countries, but 5 cents. 5 cents on a litre, as we call it here, of the fuel people put into their cars. And there were mass scale protests on the cities of Paris for 18 months afterwards, and a lot of that was to do with badly communicated policies. It was also a touchstone for many other wider elements of discontent, many of great validity in terms of particularly people in rural areas feeling left behind and feeling disregarded. So I do think there's a real danger that net zero type elements, and I see this in many political discourses, become a touchstone for ending up in divisive political debates where it becomes one side against another, or they get linked to identity debates, or they get linked to rural versus urban debates. And I think we really have to learn from how not to do it, to think about that this kind of clean energy transition becomes some kind of divisive policy. Having said that, it will become more political and more politicized. If it doesn't, it's not working, because we're talking about deep change and significant change. So if people don't notice it and don't get activated by it, then it's clearly not as strong as it needs to be. So I think we're entering quite a difficult phase in terms of how these things are discussed.
Yeah, just to say, there's a scene in the film Casablanca where the police inspector says, round up the usual suspects, and there is a temptation to go into the round up the usual stakeholders when you're going into that kind of approach. And it's something we've talked about incessantly, actually, on the Just Transition Commission in Scotland. And I think the message is here, rather than waiting for people to come to you, you've got to go out and try to engage with people where they're congregating or where they're acting together, which is why we've really tried to follow that approach of having our meetings out in different parts of the community in different parts of the country. I think the question is who is the trusted intermediaries that you can work with as well, in terms of community groups, that are genuinely trusted, perhaps by a wider part of the population. Though just to say, you have to be very, very careful about that, because we kind of took it for granted in Scotland that locally elected politicians, because they're closer to people, are the most trusted people. I was at a Just Transition event in another part of the UK, not in Scotland, where it turned out that local politicians were the least trusted bunch of people around. So you need to be extremely careful and, listen to what's going on, as well, just diving in to particular social and political contexts.
I'm going to go to a question from Hadrian Mertens Kirkwood, who works for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and just released a fantastic report on just transitions and looked at comparative practices as well. And he asks, to Jim, but I think that this could be for all of you, is that, Jim, you mentioned the burden of cost is distributed according to ability to pay. And so what does that look like within the most impacted communities? The workers who are directly impacted, like in fossil fuel industries, often have high incomes, but workers who are indirectly impacted, like in food services or accommodation, have less capacity to weather a transition. So what's a fair distribution of costs and support in Scotland?
Just to say, when we came into this question of, the cost burden, I have to say we were thinking more about the consumer side of it, as much as the kind of employment end of it, because I mean the truth is that we're trying to maintain high quality jobs, which is very often equated with well paid jobs, and it's undoubtedly the case, I think, that we've seen when people have moved from the oil and gas sector to renewable energy, they are being paid less than they were back in the oil and gas sector. It's undoubtedly the case. On the other hand, we're getting kind of anecdotal evidence that the quality of life may be better in some ways, because you don't get the kind of the volatility, the laid off, taken on kind of pattern you get in oil and gas. And sometimes people have, prefer just the physical environment that they're working in, for renewable energy. But I think the question also raised the issue of not just the people directly employed, but the people in all the ancillary industries, the indirect, the multiplier effects you get from employment in a particular sector. And I think that's particularly quite important of economic diversification in areas where you're seeing these kind of changes is very important, because many of the support jobs actually have entirely transferable skills, including the onshore bit of the oil and gas industry actually providing the technical support. And so looking for alternative means of employment and building up other sectors in these areas, I think, is also a very important part of the picture.
So maybe I can just reframe this a little bit, right? Because from trade union perspective, if somebody is making over $100,000 a year in the oil sector, we should just be excited for them. And the problem isn't that they're making a lot of money. It's that people are working in food services and hospitality, which often are jobs that are dominated by women because, we live in a gender unfair society, that they should be making more money and their jobs should be better. So as opposed to sort of saying, okay, we only have, workers can only get so much of economic productivity, and we have to divide it between these different groups of workers, what is fair? We should be saying, why aren't the employers paying tax? So why isn't there a higher corporate tax rate, or why aren't employers contributing to a just transition fund when they're extracting resources and labor from a community over time? That would be one. And then the other would be just that in a just transition, as Jim said, two things are really important. So one thing is that there have to be new jobs, and the new jobs have to be good jobs. So we actually don't accept that new entrants into the energy sector have crap jobs with poor safety at work, lower wages, poor conditions, sometimes no health and pension where that's applicable. Those jobs should be good jobs, and there's no reason why they can't be good jobs because they're providing essential services. I think the other part is that part of diversifying economies is this public investment and investment in public services in communities. And again, that can have gender impact. So if you're investing big in quality healthcare, the opposite of what's happening in Alberta, might I say, and in education, in public sector education, again, jobs that at least are more equally held by women, then you can be raising the boats of a lot of families where you have either a single head of household or you have two working parents in a household where both of them have good jobs and where those jobs in public services become, good alternatives to jobs in the energy sector. So we think there are different ways to get at this issue, as opposed to just looking at what is fair between fossil fuel workers and, let's say, a hospitality worker.
It's a great question on costs, and there's a global dimension to this that I think is important in terms of who pays globally. And I think, just to take one example, the continent of Africa historically has emitted less than 1% of the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere today, and it's facing huge questions where hundreds of millions of people still don't have access to energy. There's huge unemployment, huge social development questions. The pathway for countries there is not necessarily the same pathway as European or North American countries in terms of the net zero journey, in terms of pace choices, but also affordability. And I think, richer countries need to think about their leadership here in terms of A, moving faster because they can afford it, and B, helping other countries where affordability is a real key question. And some of the best practices, for instance, in moving out of coal sectors have been to spend huge amounts of money in those communities, in those regions, which is exactly right, but it's not equally affordable in every country in the world. And I think richer countries who are exhorting all countries to follow the lead, if I can call it that, need to think about the affordability question and who pays. And I think there's a real chance for leadership here for richer countries to both show leadership in their own work, but also help other countries, both in pure financial terms, but also recognizing the different contexts they face.
Thank you. There's a question here by order of popularity I'm going to ask for Samantha, but open to all of panelists, of course, from Emily Eaton, who asks, have you seen a lot of employers using the coming low carbon economy as cover for workforce re-education, efficiencies, and flexibilization of labor?
And also just to say that, for example, when we're working with our affiliates in India, so for some of the companies there, just to take a completely different part of the world, companies say, okay, we have to invest in all of this new technology. We have to have a lot of capital expenditure to bring down our emissions. And that means that we have less money to pay workers. So that's an excuse for redundancies. Or you also see companies using this change as an excuse to start outsourcing or offshoring or jobs, and in order to bring down costs because, wow, it is so expensive to go green. And the last thing that you see is just a part of this bigger trend of contractualization. So in all the big energy companies, they're mostly like a sort of shell of corporate services with a gigantic supply chain. And more jobs are going out in the supply chain and to the sort of lowest bidder, as opposed to being inside the company and covered by a collective bargaining agreement. So we've seen some of the big auto manufacturers say, wow, we're going to go to EVs, so we're going to set up a separate battery company and it's not covered by our existing collective bargaining agreements. So the answer to that is no. If you really want to have this change that is politically supported, where people looking at it like, wow, not only is there a good new job for me, or I have my same job, but I get to do something new, that's cool. But also lots of other people in my community are going to get better jobs because, wow, the government's finally putting money into public services. Then we're going to see over and over again this pattern that we're seeing and that Brian described in France, where people are going to be resisting, what they see as something that just brings like layoffs and higher energy costs. So everyone has a responsibility. Like we as trade unions, we don't control the capital, but we definitely can be ready for change and have plans for it and push for it. Employers have a big responsibility, and also governments have a responsibility. I don't want to leave out civil society, but I kind of feel like civil society is doing all the things that civil society can do to drive change, right? It's over in the world of work where we have more to do.
There's a question here from Lindsay McLaren, and it's directed towards Dr. Ski, but I'd like to pose it to all panelists. Could you comment further on the challenges and opportunities presented by the structure of government? For instance, if some energy, environment, or treasury are within the devolved government, while others remain at the Westminster level. And this relates to a broader question, is like, how do we work impactfully within a federal system, and what can we learn from how other countries have managed that? Because we know we have different governments, very different energy profiles across the country, and some governments really pushing for change more than others because of their political economies. So any advice you could give us?
Can I just start and say I would draw lessons very carefully, because each of these relationships has its own really quite unique character. And even within the UK, if you look at the three devolved nations in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, each of them has a very different relationship with London and Westminster. So in areas that we are thinking about, for example, fiscal policy is reserved for the UK, energy policy, so oil and gas licensing, for example, but planning, physical and spatial planning, is a devolved matter, and energy efficiency is a devolved matter. And frankly, having been in the UK Climate Change Committee and acted as their so-called Scottish champion for 10 years, I can say this is a really, really difficult issue to deal with, because the political culture, frankly, in London and Edinburgh is very, very different, and it's a perpetual challenge. So I could draw attention to lots of challenges. I don't think I can draw attention to a single opportunity that I can think of, if I'm going to be honest about it.
I agree with Jim. First of all, every local context is different, because it's a question of where the jobs are, what the resources are. If you look at India and across 29 states, some states, coal is by far the biggest single source of revenue in the whole state. In other states, it's completely zero. And also, some coal states are much richer than others, some are poorer. And generally, the coal states in India are poorer than the average for various reasons. If it's any comfort, I don't know if it is, governance towards climate change is going to be really difficult, because it tests traditional ways of doing government and policy in many ways. It needs a whole of government response. It needs some kind of magical combination of top down and bottom up. And so Canada has unique circumstances, but to be honest, so does every country, because it's going to be a test of all models in the ways we do this. I don't know that they have much to add to say. I think that Canada is not the only country facing these questions, and I think, there is something to learn from each other, but really there's no universal model that can apply everywhere.
I think, Tamara, just to say back to this, theme about the role of the state, like in a federal system like Canada, you could also look at Germany, which is also a federated system. You can look at the EU actually as a region, and the sort of commonalities, let's say, between what's happened in Germany at the national level with the big energy transition, the coal transition, what's happening in the EU is that you have sort of one set of rules or laws that are negotiated in Germany at the national level, and you have a big federal investment in infrastructure, 40 billion euro over 20 years, I believe, in Germany, just for the coal transition. And at the EU level, the EU has established a special purpose Just Transition Fund, which is funding just transition plans in different high carbon regions around the EU, where the member states have to sort of apply and they go through a process and so on. And there's supposed to be social dialogue around all of it. And then in addition, like the EU's big investment funds, the EBRD and the European Investment Bank, they also have, additional funds for just transition in Europe. So I guess where I'm going is where you have to look where the power to tax and spend is. And in a federal system, that's often with the national government, and to a lesser extent with the provinces. And then that role is really important, right? Because just to go back to it, there are some things like public services or like big infrastructure investments where you can't do it, or you certainly can't do it well with just the private sector. You actually need the public sector. You need the state to come in. You need the state to fund early stage technology and also get some of the benefits of it.
You've given us a big picture view, a lot of concrete examples, inspiration for what we can achieve, how we can achieve it, reminding us that we have done this in the past and we can do it in the future. What are some parting words of advice that you might have for us in a brief sentence or two?
There's been a lot of attention on Scotland's Just Transition Commission, but actually what we've achieved so far is quite a lot of words and recommendations. And the really big challenge is to actually turn these words and the ideas into something practical, which I think is why the next phase is going to be really important when we provide really stronger scrutiny on what government is up to. And I personally attach a lot of attention to the monitoring and evaluation framework that we've given, because unless you can identify and point your finger at actual things that are happening or not happening, you don't really have the strength to go there. So, we've come to the end of phase one, but phase two is going to be much more challenged. The tires are really hitting the road here.
I would say, if I were to give parting words there, it would be, let's stay in touch. Countries all over the world are facing very similar issues. The answers won't always be the same, but I think we all have a lot to learn from each other in conversations like this. And so I hope we can continue to make this a dialogue. Thank you.
My parting word would be, for those of you who aren't union members already, I really want to encourage you to join a union, not just in order to expand the size of the trade union movement in Alberta, but because there are a lot of big changes coming to every country and every province that depends a lot on the energy sector. And when those changes come, it's good to be part of a union so that they can bargain for you with the employer. And that also relates to people in public services.
Thank you so much for all those words. And some of the questions were speaking to that as well, Samantha, saying, unions are more relevant than ever. I can't thank you enough for taking your time from joining us from all over the world. We will stay in touch. You've inspired us today, and we will continue this dialogue. Huge thanks to our speakers and solidarity. And till next we meet.
Thank you.